Is your church a movement or an institution? Stick around for this full video to ask yourselves questions to discern this dichotomy, not as an either-or paradigm, but to better understand how to have vibrant, disciple-making, gospel growth movement dynamics within the scaffolding, the structure, the codification that an institution can provide. How do you have a good harmony of both? We're going to talk about characteristics of movements and institutions. We're going to talk about balancing the dynamics of the two. We're going to talk about leadership in both paradigms, and we'll give some examples of movements and institutions from history, namely the Methodist movement and the modern day underground Chinese church movement. I hope it's helpful so that you can consider how to balance these two and keep the vitality in your local church. My own church is a part of the Restoration movement, and at times I look at it and wonder if it's still a movement or if it has been institutionalized. I always have to ask, is there still a vibrant disciple-making culture, and what are the good parts of institution that we should keep around in the church? Brennan Manning says this: as the institution ages, risk-taking decreases. Daring gives way to rigidity. Creativity fades. The capacity to meet new challenges from unexpected directions is lost. We manufacture 1,000 logical excuses for doing nothing. So let's define a movement and then define an institution. It's important to give a definition of disciple-making movements. We're not talking about church movements or social movements necessarily, but those that forward the gospel and have disciple-making. All over the world, there are 1,500 plus disciple-making movements that have risen up in the last generation, mainly in the global south. And they come up with a definition based off of that growth that is seen, not necessarily from a particular Bible verse. And here's that definition. A disciple-making movement is a rapid and exponential increase in disciple-making churches with 1,000 or more believers within a local culture who plant multiple churches. And these churches are churches who multiply disciples, groups, and churches of obedience-based disciples, so that we can see at least 4 generations, that's important, of churches produced in 6 streams of disciple-making activity. And these streams multiply consistently into churches, usually 100 churches or more within 2 to 5 years. This is a strict definition, but it sets the barometer by which we should assess ourselves and modern-day movements. To give a simpler definition, though, perhaps this is a definition from sociology. This is one that Alan Hirsch uses. A movement is a group of individuals organized and ideologically motivated for personal or social change. It actively recruits others, committed to its purpose, and challenges established orders. So I'm going to use this more expansive and general social definition for the rest of this video. We're going to use that one as the benchmark to measure against institutions. To further paint the social picture of a movement, though, here's a few points. The first is energy and dynamism. New movements have the ability to excite and enlist others as leaders and participants. Next, you typically see a ministry to the poor or marginalized. Movements almost always involve people at a grassroots level, actively involved with the masses. Often they start their mission within those places, on the edges of society, amongst the poor. Think of the Wesleys or the Salvation Army or St. Francis. Movements have a concern for being a countercultural community. Movements call the church to be a more radical commitment, to have an active tension to the world around them. Movements usually have non-traditional or non-ordained leadership. These renewal movements or even revival movements, they're often led by people who aren't recognized formally within the status of a church or an institution that might ordain people, or a seminary. Their spiritual authority is actually coming from their actions or their prayer life. Movements usually have an institutional tension, meaning in almost every case of renewal, there's going to be tensions with the existing structures and with the existing churches. There's always going to be an issue of wineskins. Usually with movements, there's a new focus on the work of the Spirit. Not just working in the past, but working in the present. When we see these gospel revival movements start, it's usually accompanied by extraordinary prayer and fasting and reliance on the Holy Spirit. Movements usually have a thirst for renewal. They want to renew back to early Christianity and the first century church. Movements usually have an articulated value system. They have an ideology. They have goals that they've agreed upon. They have this DNA by which can multiply. It provides conceptual framework that motivates all the individuals within the movement. It gives the rationale for change, and it gives the basis for their unity. So while the movement might be decentralized or segmented all over, it can still hold on to this DNA of articulated values and goals. Movements have a personal commitment, some type of a conversion for their members that separates them from the norm and from the status quo that they came from. So this individual leaves the established order and takes on a new set of values. In Christianity, we call this baptism, when this individual commits to new patterns of behavior within the movement. And one of the main behaviors within movements is that those individuals will be actively recruiting their previous relationships into the movement. Again, the movement might be segmented or a cellular structure, but it is held together, composed of units that rally around structural ideological ties. This is true of not only the early church movement, but civil rights movement and many other movements we see throughout history. And finally, one of the biggest contrasts between movements and institutions is that movements are usually flatter, less hierarchy. They are sustained by intentional training, coaching, or discipling relationships, but usually not the hierarchy that you see within an institution. And because they're less siloed, new ideas get traction more quickly. Movements are better able to generate new leaders because they attract ambitious and creative people without that hierarchy. Now, to define an institution, and don't just think institution bad. They play a pivotal role. They give checks and balances. They implement rules and policies, and they help things to evolve gradually rather than taking off too quickly. They might have a deliberate limiting of choices so that the movement isn't going in too many directions. Hugh Heclo defines institutions in this way: inheritances of valued purposes with attendant rules and moral obligations that are stewarded by those with authority. So these institutional entities, they safeguard and steward the legacy values from their history. This is actually an indispensable framework. It's to be relied upon in order to uphold the value. It's like your body having a skeleton, or the book you're reading having grammar. Take out the grammar, take out the skeleton, and the rest falls apart. So while movement dynamics are vital to the local church, the scaffolding of institution is also necessary. It's crucial in that balance to not label movements good and institutions bad. Without institution, it's easy to lose theological accountability or the moral foundations by which the movement started. They give stability where movement gives spontaneity. So consider the following questions to assess where your church is at in this balance of movement and institution. Does your church have spontaneous growth or artificial support? Movements grow naturally and bottom up and grassroots, while institutions give life support to their organizations by sending leaders or finances or other forms of stability. They artificially keep these churches alive. In the foreign mission field, this is the gospel moving quickly with the indigenous people. It's like spontaneous combustion rather than being kept alive by foreign aid. Does your church have a vision mindset? Not just a vision written in the lobby, but a vision that every member holds to and strives for. In movements, a vision creates unity. The heartbeat of movements is a unified vision, where leaders and participants prioritize the vision above their personal preferences. They might even go without compensation in the initial stages, and the The rewards, the motivation is intrinsic as they're accomplishing the goals towards that vision. That's satisfying. That intrinsic motivation of realized goals towards a vision keeps churches reproducing. Conversely, if your church is more reliant upon an institution, it may have more of the outside life support to sustain it and extrinsic motivation rather than that intrinsic motivation. It might be the extrinsic motivation of quality control. And this artificial life support could also come from a local small core within your church. The 20% of the people doing 80% of the work, that could be an artificial life support, but that is not going to last, as those people will be overworked and burned out without the vision mindset that everyone is holding to. An overworked core in a stagnant church is no substitute for a unified vision. Does your church invite others to partner in its journey, emphasizing shared values? Hey, if we're both making disciples, hey, if we want to redeem this city, help the poor and marginalized, let's work together. That's a movement quality. Remember, movements can operate without centralized control, even without communication at times, because the cells are united by their values. These values guide their day-to-day choices rather than the rules and regulations from an institution. And it's that spirit that has a flexibility to partner not only within a church, but with other organizations. It might be multiple churches working together to bring about the kingdom of God, seeing the greater kingdom beyond their local organizations. Institutions, however, are usually more siloed and usually more turf conscious about their branding. They might actually be more concerned about the welfare of the institution than the greater good of the movement purpose. Does your church take risks? Movements are characterized by risk takers, a willingness to take risks. Members will sacrifice for the cause. Leadership in movements is results driven. Again, that intrinsic value of accomplishing goals, while leadership in institutions can be tenure driven. It can value qualifications and stability more than taking risks and getting results. So how does leadership play out in these two paradigms? Well, when it comes to transformational leadership, inspiration is the focus. The emphasis lies on that, not on institutional management. Well, when it comes to transformational leadership, the focus is inspiration, not institutional management. Healthy leaders are not meant to exploit people for the sake of an institution or a movement. Rather, the institution should exist for the purpose of empowering individuals, the frontline missionaries, equipped by leaders and their institution or movement. They should serve as a means to empower, rather than leaders managing or overseeing growth or just focusing on the doctrinal soundness, all important things, even human resources. But the emerging church and movement dynamics call for a different type of leader. This transformational leadership is rooted in discipleship, a prayerful life, a mission-driven heart, somebody who is broken for the evolving culture. Movement flows from these courageous leaders and not the other way around. In times of crisis in the church, people are not looking for managerial aid. They're looking for a leader who has delved into discipleship and emerged with a better understanding of Jesus's teaching. A leader who has delved into culture and emerged with a better understanding. But that leader has to step out from a managerial institution. It's leaders who, by making disciples, naturally contribute to the growth and vitality of the movement. I think that leadership within the church is truly realized in the context of discipleship, that you are leading when you are making a disciple, not when you're managing or administering exclusively. I love this quote from Hugh Halter. He says, 50 years ago, one of the highest virtues was loyalty, and people would give faithfully to the church, trusting the institution, the trust of the spiritual hierarchy. Today's believers are not loyal or blindly trusting. One of their highest values is meaning, and they will only give to what they see is making a visible difference. What they perceive will bring the meaning at a personal level. In old Christendom, leaders got to pick their followers. In the post-everything, no-authority world, followers now choose their leaders. They won't be picking leaders based on their leader's ability to preach or organize a religious institution. They will be following people they want to be with and live like. So we've talked about all the social studies, the characteristics, balancing movement and institution and leadership within those paradigms. Let's give some examples. First is the example of the Methodist movement, which drifted from a movement to an institution. It started with a courageous and committed leader, John Wesley, who held others accountable to his values, to his measure of holiness. He probably would have been labeled a dangerous fundamentalist today, but he was radical. It was his visionary leadership and his personal embodiment of his values that started the movement. Within this early exponential growth, every Methodist was expected to have a ministry, to live the vision. 1 out of 10 had a formal ministry position. And Wesley had some discipline and accountability to these values. He would have quarterly membership tickets to issue people who were actually fulfilling their membership. He would have annual evaluations and constant evaluations for the leadership so that they were holding to the movement values. But again, this wasn't institutional accountability just yet. It was accountability to the lifestyle that Wesley himself was living. His dedication wasn't just rhetoric, it was a lived reality, and it inspired zeal in others to embody that same commitment. They wanted to embody that same commitment. He and his followers sacrificed greatly and endured persecution. His lifestyle led him to travel almost 250,000 miles on horseback, preach 40,000 sermons, witness over 100,000 conversions, and all of this led up to, in America, the exponential growth of 35% of the population becoming Methodist within a generation. That's 1 out of 3 people becoming a Methodist. Today there are over 33 million Methodists worldwide. The movement then faced a challenge, moving from the high levels of commitment to leniency, and institutionalization set in. As Methodism became an accepted institution within society, as it became something normal, the commitment waned. It lost its evangelistic zeal, confession of sin within accountability groups faded, and the clergy professionalized. These were movement killers. One could argue that there was a pivotal moment that killed the movement. In 1850, they required all of their circuit riders, their evangelists, to undergo 4 years of institutional higher education. Previously not required, but when they were ridiculed and persecuted for not having this higher level of knowledge, they required it. Within a decade, this halted growth completely. And by 1860, they had done away with their bands and classes or their formal accountability discipleship groups. The movement had stagnated. You see, the movement dynamic, the high commitment of the members, was compromised by the institutionalization of the professionalized clergy. That should be a caution for us in the local church as well. It should have us asking the question of how we can maintain our missional fervor alongside those essential institutional elements. Emmanuel Prince, who studies movements, says this: movements can plateau or look like compressed S-curves on a chart. But there is hope when they innovate, like training more coaches to guide more discovery groups. Those are accountability groups. So if you are in a church movement or local church that is plateaued, there's hope that you can innovate and see God move again. So movements do plateau if they course correct quickly. They don't have to institutionalize, though they often do. And now, to give an example of an institution turning into a movement, I want to talk about how the underground Chinese church liberated movement from convention. The Chinese church was forced underground. They were forced to give up their institutional structures. The church was completely dismantled and in a state of extreme liminality. And it was precisely within those conditions that the people of God rekindled a movement free from their historical institutional restraints. Their latent missional potential was unleashed. And I think in any institution, within any follower of Jesus, there's the latent potential to start a movement. There's a forced removal of church structures, of traditional clergy, of higher education, denominational headquarters. All of these things went away. Leaders within the underground Chinese church movement are set apart from leadership as we know it in the West. They didn't have an external authority structure. Rather, it was inspirational leadership, an inspirational leadership that we may not even recognize here in the West, as it wouldn't be qualified here in the West. What I mean is, if you stacked up the data from an inspirational underground leader in a movement, they would be making hundreds and thousands of disciples across decentralized networks. Their leadership would be felt. But here in the West, because they're not ordained, because they don't have the higher education, we wouldn't allow them to lead. See, this inspirational moral authority of leadership is something that can belong to any follower of Jesus, and it shouldn't be replaced by the structures of an institution. Structures are needed for cooperation, but they should never replace the responsibility, authority, and functions of every believer of God. So if you're within a paradigm of clergy, buildings, institutional structures, imagine stripping that away to see a movement liberated. So if you feel yourself leaning heavily into buildings and clergy and institutional structures, imagine what might need to be stripped away so that movement can be liberated. Alan Hirsch says it this way: consider this. Why was the underground Chinese church only truly activated when all the familiar institutions of church were forcibly removed? When all the buildings, clergy, seminaries, denominational headquarters, and so forth were confiscated and the official leaders killed or imprisoned? The possibility of movement was always present in the ecclesia, but was suppressed by the imposing presence of the historical traditions. Many churches find themselves institutionalized over time. So I hope this video helps you to consider how to retain or renew movement dynamics. I hope that you can strike the balance of maintaining some organization while having the vitality of a disciple-making movement. I hope that you can strike the balance of organizational characteristics for longevity with movement dynamics for vitality. I hope that you can have the engine of a unified vision rather than an external life support of an institution to keep you going. I hope that your driving force can be a unified vision rather than an external life support pumping into you. I hope that your driving force can be an intrinsic unified vision rather than an external institutional life support. I hope that as you rediscover movement, you can infuse it within your current institution and not just tear it down. I hope that you can aim for a harmonious coexistence of the two that are both essential so that you can have effectiveness and vitality. God bless.